What's a historical fact that sounds totally fake but is true? Story 1. In World War II, British intelligence dropped a corpse dressed as an officer out of a submarine. The body had fake papers about its person, leading the Germans to believe that the Allies would attack Greece and Sardinia, when in fact the real target was Sicily. It worked well, even though they had to heat the corpse's frozen feet to get the boots on. James Bond author Ian Fleming was involved, because of course he was. Story 2. The final scene in Gladiator, where Emperor Commodus suits up as a gladiator and participates in a rigged battle in the Colosseum, is based on historical reality. Commodus really did participate in gladiator games, a lot. He was obsessed with being perceived by the Roman people as a great warrior, and since he didn't have any actual military experience, he thought he could achieve this reputation by fighting in the Colosseum in front of thousands of spectators. He spent a shitload of his reign training as a gladiator and hosting public games starring himself, where he would eliminate hundreds of wild animals with his bow in the mornings and battle other gladiators in the afternoons. The fights were, naturally, fixed to guarantee he always won and didn't suffer any serious injuries. Commodus hoped his exploits in the Colosseum would bolster his image with the people, but it did the exact opposite. Romans felt it was beneath the dignity of the office for an emperor to perform in such spectacles himself. Commodus was not an impressive fighter, and it was painfully obvious to everyone that the contests were rigged. Rome's economy was also in decline during his reign, so these events were seen as a wasteful, self-indulgent extravagance in a time of need. Commodus never fought a former General Maximus, who is a fictional character, and didn't die in the Colosseum. He was actually drowned in the bath by his wrestling trainer Narcissus in an assassination plot orchestrated by his mistress Marcia. Answer. It's also worth noting as well that real gladiatorial combat was typically not deadly. Accidents happened, of course. It was a dangerous sport, but it was exactly that, a sport. Fights to the passing did happen, but they were far from the norm, as well as not at all popular with the Roman people. The image Hollywood presents of a crowd cheering as men die screaming is just outright myth. Commodus, however, frequently used deadly weapons against his, often unarmed and untrained, opponents, though he spent a lot more time just shooting animals with a bow and arrow. When he did fight people, they were either gladiator soldiers with wooden weapons or unarmed criminals, while he wore the best armor and the finest weapons available, with a strong favor towards ranged weaponry. He also paid himself handsomely for every win he had in the arena. So basically, it would be like a sitting president wanting to be known as a warrior without having ever been in the military, then trying to remedy this by holding MMA events that they showed up to with a gun, then shot a bunch of zoo animals, plus the occasional disabled person with a military guard on hand to immediately put down anyone who looked like they might manage to hurt him anyway, then awarding themselves millions for the win. Even worse, while today, it would be super weird for a president to head off and lead a military campaign. This was a common role of an emperor of Rome, and absolutely would have gotten him the warrior image he wanted, despite generals not actually doing any fighting. So Commodus could have just, gone and done that. Like, it truly can't be overstated how ridiculous these antics made him look. Story 3. During the Middle Ages, the Pope had one of his deceased predecessors dug up, brought into a courtroom, propped up in a chair, and put on trial. They changed the rules so you're not allowed to do that anymore. Answer. So you thought you could get away from the law with that little dying stunt, huh? Well, this court finds you guilty, and everything you did as Pope we legally declare to be fake and dumb and stupid and dumb. Now throw him in the river. To the river? Can he do that? See the hat? That means I'm Pope. P-O-O-P, Pope. You better three-point that meanie into the briny deep right quick, or I'm going to raise hell. Metaphorically. Story 4. Under Lake Michigan is a Stonehenge-like rock formation and paintings from people that lived there 9,000 years ago. Answer. Also 9K years ago, hunters created a hunting structure that's now under Lake Huron. When these things were built, it was during a period called the Lake Stanley Lowstand, when the Great Lakes, but particularly Lake Huron, had much lower water levels. The structure was built on the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, which was a land bridge that connected Michigan and southern Ontario. They made 4 V-shaped rock lanes to funnel caribou into a lemonade box below a spur that was 16 feet higher than the plane the V's were on. Story 5. A man was executed for laughing in public. In 16th century France, people could face passing for excessive laughing in church. Story 6. There was a man in China. He became a sheriff of sorts of a small town. He was tasked with transporting prisoners, but some got away. The punishment for losing prisoners was passing, and being late due to recapturing said prisoners was also passing. The man decided to free all the prisoners and go into the wilderness. Some of the freedmen were so grateful they decided to follow him, and he became an outlaw. Several years and an armed rebellion later, he became the first emperor of the Han dynasty. Answer: this is a lesson in why overly harsh punishments don't necessarily improve things. If you commit armed robbery and are being pursued by the police, you're more likely to surrender to Swedish police and take a rehab program and some incarceration at a respectful prison. If you're in the U.S., there's a good chance there isn't a straightforward way to leave that situation without a couple of magazines unloaded at you. At best, you're looking at a decade behind bars in a prison system where shower violation is a joke punchline. You're more likely to use extreme force against police and bystanders to evade capture. Story 7. The name Tiffany is really old, and I mean impressively old. However, to a lot of people, Tiffany sounds like a modern Valley Girl name, which has led certain historians to use the term the Tiffany problem to describe things that sound anachronistic but actually aren't. Story 8. We think of parties in history as those fancy balls full of ceremony and etiquette, but really, they were as wild as we are today. Admiral Edward Russell wanted to throw a party for 6,000 of his close friends, so he drained the garden fountain and filled it with a few thousand gallons of homemade punch. He hired bartenders to paddle around on canoes and scoop cups for partygoers. His punch was so boozy, the bartenders were passing out from the fumes. Bands rotated in and out so the music never stopped. Cooks served a buffet, and they kept going until they drank the fountain dry. 8 days later. Story 9. A person who witnessed the shooting of Abraham Lincoln appeared on live TV in 1956, and there is a person who could have lived to meet both Thomas Jefferson and Ronald Reagan. Answer: when I taught high school, I used to tell the students that I was born only 20 years after the end of WW2, and my mother was shipped off to the country as a small child because of the German bombing. I taught high school in 2020. I tried to put time in perspective for students, but honestly, I don't think they could comprehend. My mom was alive as a child in WW2. It wasn't that long ago. Story 10. In 1946, Hungarian inflation hit the highest ever recorded at 41.9 quadrillion % a month. Prices doubled every 15 hours. Story 11. Carrots were originally not orange. Dutch farmers used selective breeding in the 17th century to make them orange from purple or yellow, all done in honor of the House of Orange. Story 12. Since 1970, so 55 years, there have been more popes, 5, than head coaches of the Pittsburgh Steelers, 3. Story 13. Warner Bros. Used to have the rights for Happy Birthday to You, except they didn't actually have them. But no one could prove they didn't have them until 2015. Story 14. The Austrian army lost a battle to the Ottomans before the Ottomans even showed up to fight. 2 Austrian forces thought the other was a Turkish army and fought each other until retreating. Story 15. The Erfurt latrine disaster. In 1184, the King of Germany held a court date in Erfurt to solve a local dispute. No one knows exactly where it happened, but they all met up in second floor of the building. The combined weight of the group caused the rotten support beams to collapse and drop the nobles into the cesspit, old times bathroom, below. According to records, 60 nobles died from the fall, and some are said to have drowned in the human waste. TLDR. A group of German nobles got thrown into a latrine and died a horrible passing. Answer: the Cincinnati Privy disaster in 1904 at the Pleasant Ridge School eliminated 6 little girls out of the more than 30 who fell in. 2 of my grandmother's sisters were rescued from the 12-foot deep vault below the girls' outhouse. After that incident, communities around the United States demanded laws that required yearly inspections of school outhouses. Story 16. Roald Dahl was a spy in World War II, and he got a lot of info by fudge the wives of enemy officers. Apparently, he did it so much that he got burnt out on it, and when he told his superiors, the response was, "Close your eyes and think of England." Answer: the phrase is often attributed to Queen Victoria. Supposedly, she said that to her daughters when telling them to do their wifely duty. Except there's no way she would say that because the woman loved intimacy. You don't have that many kids if you don't like intimacy. In fact, when her doctor said she shouldn't have any more kids because of the risk to her health, she asked if there was a way to keep having intimacy without getting pregnant. Story 17. Men walked on the moon. It's fun and easy to say since we all know it's true, but go outside and look at the moon and say it out loud. The idea is fudge insane. Story 18. The world's population was 1 billion in 1800, 2 billion in 1900, grew 6 billion in 125 years. That's a 7 billion added in 200 years. Story 19. People carried volcanic glass, used to make arrowheads, from Central Oregon to Lake Huron. In Lake Huron, there is a migratory pathway, the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, AAR, connecting Alpena, Michigan to Amberley, Ontario, that existed about 9,000 years ago when lake levels were lower. Native hunters built stone structures to hunt migrating caribou along this path. Along this path, modern archaeologists have identified obsidian flakes from arrowhead manufacture that originated in Central Oregon. Remember, there were no horses in North America at this point. They went extinct circa 10,000 years ago until reestablished by Europeans. So many people carried that from the original source, probably through a trading network concentrated along waterways to the hunters. You can drive this distance in about 4 days. Please, I hope I never have to again. So it must have been months getting there, over 2,500 miles, likely much more, and unspeakably precious to the hunters who had no real equivalent in the limestone and glacial till of the area, though there was granite and others, but nothing like the gorgeous volcanic glass of obsidian. Imagine what was traded for it. Likely rare native copper from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, though there's no proof of that, and what motivation it took to make the trek. Edit. Originally, I meant this. Fixed. Story 20. The Great Molasses Flood was a disaster on January 15, 1919, when a 50-foot-tall steel tank in Boston's North End ruptured, unleashing a 2.3 million-gallon wave of molasses that eliminated 21 people and injured over 150 others. Story 21. One wild fact is that Napoleon was once attacked by a horde of bunnies during a hunt. He had ordered hundreds of rabbits for a grand event, but instead of running away, the rabbits swarmed him because they were farm-raised and thought he had food. It sounds like a cartoon, but it really happened. Even great military leaders can't plan for rabbits. Story 22. There was metalworking in North America before there was metalworking in the Old World. The Native American Old Copper culture was mining, shaping, and trading copper in vast quantities to make weapons, jewelry, armor, and decorations well before copper use became widespread in Eurasia. Edit. Grammar. Answer. The claim is incorrect. The Old World developed metalworking significantly earlier than North America, as the earliest known human metalworking dates back to around 8700 BCE in the Middle East, whereas the earliest American metalworking from the Old Copper culture in North America emerged around 400,000 BCE. While North America had sophisticated pre-Columbian metalworking, particularly with copper, its development was later than that of the Old World and focused on natural metals rather than smelting. Story 23. If you talk to George Washington about dinosaurs, he would question your sanity. He died in 1799, and dinosaurs were not discovered until 1824. Nobody on the planet, including him, ever heard of such a thing in his time. Lucky thing, getting the country going was a big enough job. He didn't need no giant lizard nonsense to keep him awake at night. Story 24. Admiral Yi Sun-shin of Joseon, Korea, defeated a Japanese armada of 250 to 300 ships with 13 Korean ships during the Battle of Myeongryang in 1597. Answer. The reason he only had 13 ships is because his predecessor, Won Gyun, lost almost the entire Korean Navy in an ambush after Yi was demoted for cowardice. Translation. Yi was smart enough not to fall into the same trap, and his political opponents jumped at the opportunity to discredit him. Yi selected the Strait of Myeongyang for his next battle because he knew something the Japanese didn't: the current reverse direction every few hours. Korean ships also had naval cannon, while the Japanese preferred boarding tactics. So Yi kept his ships far away while firing volley after volley at the enemy. Then the current reversed, and the Japanese shops started slamming into one another. Some like to call Yi the Nelson of the East, but that's an extremely Eurocentric view. There are many experts who consider Yi to be the greatest admiral in history. He never lost a naval battle, even the one he died in. Extra History has an excellent series on Yi. Story 25. Where Pleistocene animals lived made no sense. jaguars, tapirs, camels, and sloths in the eastern U.S., lions, hyenas, and elephants in Europe, lemmings in Mexico, bears in Africa, monkeys in the Caribbean, giant tortoises that didn't live on islands, and during warm periods, vast forests in Iceland and Greenland. Story 26. Canadians added to the Geneva Conventions by following the "it's not a war crime the first time" mindset. WW1. Trench warfare sucked and often resulted in forces being stalled out within shouting distances of each other. One year, the Germans were literally starving and could be heard meaning loudly about it to each other, until, suddenly, from a nearby Canadian trench, a can was lobbed into the German trench. After the Germans got back up from the hiding cover areas they had all dove into, they discovered it was a tin of corned beef. Quickly ripped open and devoured, they yelled thanks, and a few asked for more, and a few more cans were tossed over, and the Germans again dove for cover. More cans of corned beef. This was repeated a few times, until there was a large congregation of relaxed, hungry Germans, all clumped into that trench calling out for more. And then the Canadians threw over several hand grenades which exploded almost immediately after landing in the German trenches. Story 27. To reduce the draft, how much boat was underwater, the Russians built a perfectly circular boat. Issue is, the layout meant it was impossible for the rudder to get the correct water flow to turn the boat, meaning it took forever to turn. The engines were badly built, and the cannons were so heavy and placed in such positions that, if they were stationary or not moving fast enough, firing one cannon could cause the entire boat to spin uncontrollably. They parked both off onto the coast and scrapped them soon after. Story 28. President John Tyler, born 1790, had a grandson, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, who passed away in May 2025. Harrison was also a descendant of Pocahontas. Story 29. 4 months before John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, John's brother Edmund saved a small boy from getting hit by a train at a station in New Jersey. He ran onto the tracks and pushed the boy to safety. The boy's name? Robert Lincoln, President Lincoln's son. Answer: you're so close. This is such a great story, I hope you don't mind me sharing an article with the account of this incident from Lincoln himself. How Edwin Booth saved Robert Todd Lincoln's life. Robert Todd Lincoln was not a boy, but an adult, 21, and the Booth who saved him was Edwin, not Edmund. There was a crowd on the train platform, and Robert Todd was pressed up against the train by the crowd when the train began to move unexpectedly. The movement knocked him off his feet, and he was falling in the gap between the train and the platform. Edwin Booth grabbed Robert Todd's coat and kept him from falling and saved his life. Story 30. In 1518, there was a dancing plague in Strasbourg, France, where hundreds of people danced uncontrollably for days, and some even collapsed or died from exhaustion. Story 31. In 1795, French cavalry negotiated the surrender of Dutch warships that were trapped in the ice of the Texel Sea from horseback. Story 32. In 1140, there was the siege of Weinsberg, in what is now Germany. The besieging monarch, King Conrad III, allowed the women to leave with whatever they could carry, so they carried their husbands and menfolk. The king was impressed at this ingenuity and honored his word. This inspired the scene in Ever After. Story 33. Color television broadcasts began 3 years before any country in Africa attained independence from colonialism. Story 34. Coal can never be formed again on Earth. Coal was formed from carbon-dense vegetation like trees dying and falling on top of each other. Natural processes filling the gaps. More trees growing, dying, repeat for millions of years. The microbes that break down wood hadn't evolved yet, so this deposit just got more and more dense, eventually becoming coal. Story 35. While it sounds like an urban legend, contemporary reports mention the incident, making it a bizarre moment in American history where a tiny cat caused major chaos. Story 36. Titanic's older sister, Olympic, spent her entire life slamming into other things and sinking them, including a German U-boat. The only instance of a civilian ship deliberately sinking a submarine by ramming it. Story 37. There was a man who was present at Hiroshima and Nagasaki when both atomic bombs were dropped. He survived. Story 38. At one point in human history, about 74,000 years ago, all of humanity was reduced to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 people. Researchers think it's because of the Toba catastrophe, in which a supervolcano erupted in Indonesia and caused a volcanic winter for many years. The entirety of our 8 billion current population descended from this tiny collection of surviving individuals. Answer: this is not a fact. It is actually debated heavily. This sort of genetic bottleneck can also be caused by population spread, i.e., human populations moving apart enough to be genetically isolated from each other. While there was a supervolcano event around that time, it was not the only one in human history, and other similar or even more severe events didn't cause that kind of bottleneck. In fact, we have evidence of people being at the location of the volcano as soon as just a few years after the fact, or even the following year. Story 39. A Swedish warship called Vasa sank in 1628 and was recovered, fully intact in 1961. There is now a museum dedicated to it in Djurgården, Sweden, and you can actually see this ship in all its glory. Answer: you skipped the craziest parts. It was constructed to be the biggest ship in the world, to fight against the Poles, but they made it too top-heavy, and people were too scared to go against the king's orders, so they let it happen. The ship made it less than a mile before sinking in the harbor. After some debate on how to best preserve the ship, conservation was carried out by impregnation with polyethylene glycol, PEG, a method that has since become the standard treatment for large waterlogged wooden objects, such as the 16th century English ship Mary Rose. Vasa was sprayed with PEG for 17 years, followed by a long period of slow drying, not entirely complete by 2011. Story 40. Wilmer McLean was a Virginia farmer whose land was the scene of the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. After the battle, he decided to move his family farther west to avoid the fighting and settled in the town of Clover Hill, Virginia, which later changed its name to Appomattox Courthouse after it became the county seat. 4 years later, a contingent of Union officers were looking for a location to hold the surrender ceremony at which Lee would officially cease fighting. As most of the structures in town had been damaged in the war, they settled on the front sitting room of Wilmer McLean's new house. So the same guy hosted the start and end of the Civil War. Story 41. King Henry VIII employed a groom of the stool to help him clean up after he'd been to the toilet. It was an extremely coveted position to have, and all the nobles vied for it. This is because it got you up very close and personal to the king, so you could bend his ear, as well as wipe his arse. Anyway, there was one instance when, by that time, extremely overweight King Henry had been constipated for weeks. The groom of the stool was happy to report to the king's physician that the king has had a mighty fair siege. I can't imagine the horror of that mud out. Story 42. At the 50th Academy Awards, John Williams was nominated for his work on Close Encounter of the Third Kind, but didn't win, and was runner-up to John Williams of Star Wars. Story 43. Two of the most well-known athletic wear companies were founded by brothers who had a falling out due to a misunderstanding, starting a generations-long rivalry. Adolf, Adi, and Rudolf Dassler. The companies? Adidas and Puma, originally Rudi Das. Story 44. Sacagawea randomly met one of her family members, whom she was separated from while on the expedition with Lewis and Clark. She ended up reuniting with her tribe as a result. Story 45. The Taiping Rebellion. 30 million Chinese died because some guy claimed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Story 46. A cowboy, a samurai, and a Victorian gentleman walk into a bar. It's a setup for a joke but could reasonably happen. They all existed at the same time in history. Story 47. The period of time between the first ever episode of The Simpsons and The Simpsons movie, almost the same period of time between The Simpsons movie and today. Story 48. The Tea Act of 1773, which we're taught was one of the main causes of the Boston Tea Party and the U.S. Revolution, actually lowered the taxes on tea imported to the colonies. Story 49. In the time of the German Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933, inflation was so bad that it was more cost-efficient to burn stacks of paper money than buy coal for heating. Additionally, when bread could be had, a single loaf sold for approximately a wheelbarrow full of cash. I recently bought a single 100,000 Weimar Deutschmark banknote for $2 just for the strangeness of it. Story 50. The last execution by guillotine in France took place the year after Star Wars 4 was released. Story 51. No other civilization had water infrastructure as advanced and sophisticated as the Roman Empire until the late 1800s. Answer. The Minoans had running water in their palaces. Through pipes, they also had pipes for sewage, and at least one of their palaces had a flushing toilet designed similarly to modern toilets. Valves, lever, tank, etc. Even a wooden seat, built around 1700 BCE. They also had pipes of hot running water beneath some of the palace rooms to hear the floors. Story 52. George IV of England donated a snuff box filled with his mistress's pubic hair to a intimacy club. Dude was a total perv. Have read too much about him researching the Regency for my stories. Story 53. The entire idea of the Hollywood cowboy comes from one man, Texas Jack Omohundro. He was a Civil War vet, scout, frontiersman, and expert big game hunter. He, along with Wild Bill Hickok, starred in the first stage shows featuring the Wild West. After Wild Bill decided he can't act and left, Texas Jack recruited people like Buffalo Bill Cody and made his own stage plays. Story 54. Joseph Stalin was arguably the most successful bank robber adjusted for inflation. His 4 big robberies and the smaller ones combined were at a value in today's money of 270 million USD. Story 55. The National Hockey League was pretty much created as a big, screw you, we're making our own club and not inviting you, to one guy. Story 56. The Scuderia Ferrari racing team was founded in 1929, while Ferrari didn't become an automaker until 1947. Story 57. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world at the time, and no one has a clue where he's buried. Story 58. In 1561, a newspaper reported that the people of Nuremberg claimed to have witnessed an aerial battle out of the sun, followed by the appearance of a large black triangular object and exhausted combatant spheres falling to earth in clouds of smoke. Link to the Wikipedia article for further reading. Story 59. It was only 2.5 years from the Beatles' first concert in the U.S. until their last, and during that time, they performed approximately 50 shows in the U.S. Story 60. Several Victoria Crosses were awarded posthumously by the British military during World War II on the recommendations of enemy commanders. Story 61. Jerry Ryan, Star Trek, unknowingly helped Barack Obama get elected. I know it's not a direct cause, but it's still weird this happened like this. Story 62. In WW2, the Soviet Union strapped explosives onto dogs and trained them to bury themselves under tanks by smelling diesel. They used Russian tanks using Russian diesel instead of German tanks using gasoline. So, those who weren't scared by the sounds of the tanks or the fog of war smelled diesel, ran under Soviet tanks, and had to be eliminated. The Nazis found out and ordered all Russian dogs to be eliminated. Story 63. The last recorded and confirmed longbow eliminate in the British military was during WW2 by Jack Churchill, also known as Mad Jack. He was part of the invasion of Sicily and charged the island playing the bagpipes. He got captured but wasn't eliminated on sight because the Germans believed they captured a nephew of Winston Churchill. He had no affiliation to Winston Churchill. Story 64. Oh man, I've been waiting for this. Columbus brought pineapples back to Europe, but tomatoes were brought by Cortez much later. So it's possible pineapple was on a pizza before tomatoes. Story 65. During the 1798 United Irishmen Rebellion, an Irish rebel faced off against British muskets and cannons with a 2,500-year-old sword from the Bronze Age. Story 66. When Congress passed the law creating a 0.05 bill, they wanted Clark's face on it. They meant William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but the law only said Clark. At the time, the head of the Currency Bureau was a guy named Spencer Clark. He printed thousands of dollars worth of bills with his own face on it before anyone notices. They later passed a new law saying living people couldn't be minted on U.S. money. Story 67. After the American Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau established schools to educate the freed people. All across the South, they funded and supported schools, and those school records were kept in the state archives. The records that were reported to the Freedmen's Bureau were reports of class size, how the surrounding population reacted to the schools, how well the students took to their studies, etc. But one line under class size asked how many white pupils attended the schools. The schools were for children of both races, as many of the poorest whites were refugees, and they had also never had the opportunity to receive an education. So the children of the poor whites were admitted to all of these schools and seemed to be interested in learning. But then their parents were angry to learn that they learned in the same room as black children, and pulled their children out of school. A decent amount of poor white people, all across the southern United States, chose illiteracy and ignorance for their children over integration. Over time, many social welfare policies were eliminated in the cradle, simply because it was help offered to both black and white people. And the greatest insult to the poor white trash was to treat them the same as black people. That's why the South is so stunted socially and economically today. White trash supremacy. Fourth generation poor white trash. Story 68. Malcolm X and Ho Chi Minh worked, at different times, at the same hotel in Boston that JFK proposed to Jackie Kennedy at, the now Omni Parker House Hotel. Story 69. Japan was the first country to use WMDs in WW2. They used chemical and biological weapons in China. Answer. After the American Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the Japanese army searched for the air crews in China and massacred around 250,000 civilians during that search. At one point, they experimented with various bioweapons to punish villages that might have helped the Americans. And in one attempt, typhoid I think, they even managed to eliminate several thousand of their own troops. Story 70. During World War II, the Germans built decoy airfields, Attrappenflugplätze, with wooden planes and hangars to fool the Allies. There's an anecdote, not confirmed to be true, that the RAF mocked one by dropping a wooden bomb. Story 71. The east coast of North America and the west coasts of Africa and Europe share the same mountain range, torn asunder by plate tectonics. The ancient mountains are older than trees, the rings of Saturn, and sharks. They contain no fossils. Story 72. In 1676, the Swedish Navy lost a naval engagement against Denmark before it even started, by having their flagship, the Crown, capsize, explode, and sink in full view of the enemy fleet. After this, the rest of the Swedish fleet opted to retreat rather than fight the Danish fleet. Story 73. Andrew Jackson is responsible for the passing of tens of thousands of innocent Native Americans with his Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court at the time, under Chief Justice Marshall, ruled against the act. Jackson replied, "You made it law. Now let's see you enforce it." He ordered the military to force march the southeastern tribes, in the winter, on a forced march to Oklahoma. Thousands of Indians died from either exhaustion, malnourishment, or froze to passing. And Andrew Jackson is Trump's hero. Jackson's method was also studied heavily by none other than Adolf Hitler. And now you know the rest of the story. Answer. Andrew Jackson was also the first POTUS to have an assassination attempt. The guy walked up to Jackson, pulled out a pistol and shot. It misfired. He pulled out a second one, misfired again. Jackson then did what Jackson was good at and beat the ever-loving shit out of the guy. Jackson would have eliminated the man had his Jackson's security not intervened and pulled Jackson off. Story 74. Transporting, storing, and selling natural ice harvested from lakes was a huge industry in the decades before refrigeration was common. Entire globe-spanning corporations existed selling branded ice in shipments that would take multiple ton blocks of it from one place to the next. Story 75. The guy who single-handedly invented the Californian raisin industry, Gustav Eisen, was a hugely important scientist in the taxonomy of earthworms, but his collection of type specimens burned in the San Francisco earthquake fire while he helped rescue the botany collection of a colleague. He later went off the deep end in search for the Holy Grail. He had come to Agassiz for a PhD on insects, who had sent him on a field trip west and then died without telling anyone. So no one knew the guy Eisen, and he had to start from scratch. His biography is wild. Story 76. The log cabin wasn't invented in the United States, despite the strong association it has with the country. It was brought by the Swedes for their colony, based in what is now Wilmington, Delaware. Story 77. The same ones that were on this thread from last week. Mammoth versus Pyramids. Abe Lincoln and Samurai Fax Machine. Story 78. In 1866, during the Austro-Prussian War, the Principality of Liechtenstein sent a contingent of 80 soldiers to guard the Spligan Pass, on the border with Italy. When the conflict ended and the soldiers returned home, the incredible happened. The contingent consisted of 81 men. According to legend, an Italian soldier had joined them along the way, becoming a new friend, and returning with the Liechtenstein army. Thus, the Liechtenstein army not only suffered no casualties or injuries, but also returned from the war with an extra soldier. This, in fact, makes Liechtenstein the only country in history to participate in a war without suffering losses, indeed gaining a citizen. Story 79. William the Conqueror was so bloated, and abandoned monks jumped on his bloated body to get it into the coffin, and he burst. This was done because everyone wanted the throne and would steal it. Despite this, his sons still ended up with the throne. There are many questions and no answers. Story 80. A U.S. president pardoned protesters who beat police officers with an American flag. These same protesters then literally took a shoot on the floor of the Capitol building. Story 81. In 1919, after a containment tank burst, over 2 million gallons of molasses flooded part of Boston, eliminating 21 people and injuring over 150. The wave of molasses was apparently 35 feet high. Story 82. In late 1864 or early 1865, Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln, was nearly crushed by a train at a station in Jersey City, but he was rescued by Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's brother. Story 83. Orville Wright lived long enough to fly on a plane that's wingspan exceeded his first powered flight's length. Story 84. This one is for my Dominican countrymen and women. When the PRM Majority Congress, during Hipólito Mejía's presidency, declared Joaquin Balaguer as the father of democracy. The fact that that happened and we just took it and accepted it is the day I understood our country deserves all the BS we've been through and will continue to face, and all the POS running it. We own it. Story 85. All medieval castles and cathedrals were painted in bright colors once, and rich people dressed in fine dyed linen, silk, wool, or damask, not shoot leather like in movies. Even peasants wore colorful clothing made from local plants used as dyes. Story 86. When the U.S. was founded, the border was open. We had open borders until the 1800s. How's that for originalism? Story 87. Tea wasn't poured into the harbor because it was too expensive, but because it was so cheap that no one was buying domestically. Story 88. Governments of the, quote, civilized modern world knowingly allowed and even assisted in the execution of a full-blown genocide in the early 21st century. Story 89. In 1866, Liechtenstein sent an army detachment of 80 men to guard the Italian border. The contingent saw no action, and indeed, no enemy. 80 men sent out. 81 returned in September to general rejoicing, having been joined by an Austrian soldier who was looking for work. Story 90. In 2 of the 5 presidential elections in the USA from 2000 to 2016, the Republican candidate won with fewer votes. Between 1988 and 2024, a Republican candidate only once got the most votes in a presidential election, which was in 2004. Story 91. My 5th great-grandfather on my black sheep side of the family met his maker at the end of a turkey talon. He was holding it up by the neck to gander at its plumage, or some such goofiness, and then swipe, no more old grandpappy. Story 92. In 1814, there were over 3 billion passenger pigeons in North America. By 1914, there were none. Story 93. During WW2, while storming a Japanese island, a U.S. destroyed sustained heavy damage, and hundreds of American and Canadian soldiers were eliminated. It was only afterwards they learned that the Japanese weren't even there, having pulled out weeks earlier. It was called Operation Cottage. Story 94. The researcher F.D.C. Willard is the listed co-author of a research paper, 2, 3, and 4 atom exchange effects. The FDC is short for Felix Domesticus Chester. The journal it was published in requires more than one author on papers, so Jack Hetherington listed his cat as a co-author. FDC went on to be the solo author of a paper in the French journal La Recherche. Story 95. 2 ships from the Battle of Tsushima Strait during the Russo-Japanese War over 100 years ago are still afloat. They're museum ships, Mikasa in Yokosuka, Japan, and Aurora in St. Petersburg, Russia. Story 96. Napoleon was afraid of cats. Historical records suggest Napoleon had a bizarre fear of cats and would get uneasy around them. Story 97. 10th U.S. President John Tyler, serving from 1841 to 45, had a grandson that passed away just this year in 2025. Story 98. Colonel, Sir Tommy McPherson, the kilted killer, during World War II, was such a successful saboteur, assisting the French resistance, that the Germans put a 30,000 franc bounty on his head. His exploits are too numerous and mind-boggling to list, always carried out dressed in his traditional native attire, yes, kilt and all. But his most audacious was in 1944, where Macpherson famously bluffing his way into the German command post, wearing his Highland attire, and single-handedly orchestrated the surrender of around 23,000 German soldiers from the elite SS Das Reich division by pretending he had reinforcements and could call in the RAF for air support. Seriously, people, you need to read about his exploits. Story 99. Rich people used to have living garden gnomes. They'd build a little hobbit hole house on their giant country estate or whatever, then hire a random guy to just live there, without ever leaving. And that was pretty much it. According to Wikipedia, some were consulted for advice. Story 100. Famous clown and rapist Donald J. Trump won the U.S. elections and became U.S. president not once, but twice. Story 101. The Viking had some superior swords, Ulfpert, that were made in Franconia. From steel ingots that the Vikings imported from Persia, sold to the Franks, who made swords and sold them back to the Vikings for a huge profit that they used to hire mercenaries to defend against the Vikings and their bloody good swords. Ah, Europe, catch-22, and everyone has a share. Story 102. The Russians lost the Battle of Chernaya during the Crimean War because their top general sent out a note to his officers that said, "Let's start it." He meant to deploy the forces to the river to wait while cavalry and artillery support was still en route, but his officers thought it was an order to attack at once. So the Russians attacked without the proper cavalry and artillery support they were supposed to wait for, and the French and British easily won. Story 103. There were archaeologists in ancient Egypt studying the ruins and artifacts of even ancienter Egypt. And there were even ancient history museums. That empire was around for a long time. Story 104. The host of The Apprentice is the president of the U.S., and he bangs adult content stars, and Kid Rock is his advisor. Story 105. All 54 people directly named in "We Didn't Start the Fire" were alive between 26 May 1951 and 26 September 1952. Story 106. The current president of the great United States is a 34-count convicted felon, adjudicated rapist, who was Jeffrey Epstein's best friend for 10 years. If that doesn't sound contrived, what possibly could? However, it's true as rain. Story 107. During WW2, a Hungarian soldier disabled a Soviet tank by jamming his shovel into its tracks, forcing the crew to surrender. Story 108. If you were born a female, you are descended from an uninterrupted line of mothers spanning roughly 2 billion years, when the first living beings capable of intimacy reproduction appeared. Story 109. Founding fathers John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826. Story 110. Pierre Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, was on the FBI's blacklist from 1951 until his passing in 2000. He didn't become Prime Minister in 1968, nor did he work for the government until 1965. Story 111. The Roman Emperor Valentinian has a meeting with some Germanic envoys. He gets extremely pissed off at what they say to him, and so he starts yelling at them and berating them. He gets so worked up that, in the middle of his tirade, he suffers a stroke and dies. Story 112. The Great Molasses Flood was a disaster that occurred on January 15, 1919. In Boston, Massachusetts, when a large storage tank burst, releasing 2.3 million gallons of molasses that swept through the streets at 35 miles per hour, eliminating 21 people and injuring 150. The event highlighted serious safety issues and led to changes in construction regulations. Story 113. How about this? Oxford University is older than the Aztec Empire. Just goes to show how history can be full of surprises. Story 114. There was a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi who was outside in Hiroshima when the first atom bomb dropped. He survived in a ditch. He then caught a train to head back to his home in Nagasaki. Went to work a couple days later and was in his office building when the bomb dropped there as well. He survived that too. Story 115. John Quincy Adams frequently took private pictures swims in the Potomac. One day a reporter stole his clothes and refused to give them back until he agreed to an interview. Story 116. Iceland has defeated the UK in several wars, the Cod Wars. They were pissed off about the UK trying to fish in their waters, so just decided to expand their fishing territory claims every time. In my opinion, the UK is lucky Iceland didn't stage a full-scale invasion, because they would have stood no chance. Answer. Yes, the Cod Wars. The first Cod War, 1958 to 1961. The second Cod War, 1972 to 1973. The third Cod War, 1975 to 1976. As for what happened, well, putting it bluntly, on 3 occasions, Iceland said, "We want to expand our territorial waters." The UK said, "No." Iceland threatened to leave NATO, and the US made the UK agree to the territorial fishing waters change. It really is remarkable how they pulled this stunt 3 times, and it worked every time. Story 117. In the 1980s, the Chinese government thought there were too many people being born in rural Western China, so they sent officials to teach the farmers how to use contraceptives. These farmers would then go and show their friends and families how to use birth control. After the training program was over, the officials came back and were satisfied with their work. 9 months later, the population exploded. Confused, the government sent these officials back out to find out what was going on. When they gathered a bunch of men to ask if they'd been doing the things they were told and shown to do, they all replied they had. The men were taking the pill and putting condoms on their fingers during intimacy. They were confused how putting condoms on their fingers was supposed to stop babies, but the men showing them how to use the condoms had done so by using their finger in place of their privates. So that's what the peasants thought they were supposed to do. The pill was also a pure matter of miscommunication. Story 118. A German sexologist named Helmut Kentler ran a social experiment with government approval in West Berlin from the 1960s to the 1990s, in which orphans would be placed into foster care with pedophiles. I believe the idea behind it was that parental instinct would kick in and override the attraction to the children, and they were trying to see if having to take care of a child would fix the child molesters. You can probably guess how that ended up going, though. Story 119. There was once an 8-foot-tall Thracian peasant who was Roman emperor from 235 to 238. This guy's name was Maximius Thrax, or Max Thrax. Isn't that insane? The emperor of Rome was a fudge 8-foot-tall unit called Max Thrax, the final boss of the Roman legion. I can imagine this cunt wading through Parthia, just flinging people all over the place. Sauron at the Black Gate style. Story 120. There would be loads more mummies about, but we've eaten them. Victorians or some such thought they were medicinal, so they all got eaten. Story 121. During the Anglo-Boer War, they paused the war for a moment so that the Boers and the British could play rugby against each other. Answer. It almost happened. They'd exchanged notes over the parapets. ABS Major Edwards readily agreed to the ceasefire and the match and said that he would get a field ready. But alas, the afternoon before the planned game, a group of Boers ambushed a British column and fighting broke out. 4 British soldiers and 6 Boers were eliminated. So, probably sensibly, the match was called off. The Christmas Day 1914 football match happened, though. I always thought it was a myth. Story 122. Once there was a famous democracy in which the president, who just lost a re-election campaign, tried to pull off a coup. He failed and was publicly chastised. However, due to the incompetence of the opposing party, as well as the compliance of billionaire-owned media, he was allowed to run and win the next election. Story 123. Trump received the most votes of any sitting president in his re-election bid of 2020 and still lost. Story 124. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. The samurai were formally abolished in 1867. The electric printing telegraph was invented in 1843. Abraham Lincoln could have, theoretically, sent a fax to a samurai. Story 125. Laos is the most heavily bombed country in the world. Unexploded ordnances are still being found today. The most heavily bombed country in the world by USA. People knew about Laos, as JFK said in a televised statement, that Laos was a neutral country and we didn't want war with Laos. Unexploded ordnance is still eliminate people in Laos. President Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Laos since the bombings. Didn't apologize for the bombing, but did state, "Given our history here, I believe that the United States has a moral obligation to help Laos heal, he said. 580,000 bombing runs by the U.S. 2,093,100 tons of ordnance was dropped on Laos. 30 of ordnance dropped did not detonate. 20,000 people have been eliminated by unexploded ordnance since the last ordnance was dropped. Most heavily bombed country in the world. JFK said that I want to make it clear to the American people and to all the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war. JFK promised that Laos was a neutral country. While not apologizing, Obama said, whatever the cause, whatever our intentions, war inflicts a terrible toll. Given our history here, I believe that the United States has a moral obligation to help Laos heal. Story 126, two of my favorites. The Allies fielded a secret unit of artists who used inflatable tanks, fake radio, and giant loudspeakers to create armies in World War II. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, aka the Ghost Army, fooled the Germans multiple times. In 1919, a wave of molasses, 2.3 million gallons, apparently somewhere around 25 feet high, rushed through Boston after a storage tank burst, eliminated 21 people and flattening buildings. Story 127. Donald Trump, a game show host, 80s con man and rapist, was elected twice as the President of the United States in modern times, with modern education and technology available to the masses. Story 128. Cleopatra lived closer to the pyramids than to the moon. The pyramids in Giza are only about 200 kilometers from Alexandria, where she lived, while the moon is 384,400 kilometers away. That's 384,200 kilometers further. Story 129. People are getting fired and forced to apologize in the name of free speech because they spoke the truth about a dead fascist. Story 130. In 1958, the United States Air Force inadvertently dropped a nuclear bomb in South Carolina. Fortunately, the nuclear explosive part of the bomb was not active, but the other explosive components were. It injured 6 people on the ground and damaged multiple buildings. Story 131. Elvis Presley asked then-President Richard Nixon to become a federal agent. Nixon gave him an honorary Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Substances badge. Presley, who was suffering with addiction, may have believed that he was granted actual power or immunity from substances crime. He wasn't. There is a famous photo of Nixon presenting the badge to Presley, and a pretty good tipsy history segment on it. Story 132. After winning the Civil War, started mainly because the liberals rewrote the Constitution with their ideology, and defeating the conservatives, the liberals almost recognized the breakaway Mapuche Patagonian nation started by a French lawyer who declared himself king. They decided to better write a new constitution with more mixed ideologies, literally called the Moderate Constitution. Story 133. In the 1980s, the CEOs of Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward were brothers. CEO of Sears Roebuck Company, Edward Brennan, was born in Chicago into a family of Sears associates. His grandfather, father, and uncles all worked there, and his younger brother, Bernard F. Brennan, left Sears for the rival, Chicago-based retailer, Montgomery Ward, and became its CEO in 1985. Story 134. Seeing others have already mentioned Sir Christopher Lee, I will give you another one. Roald Dahl, author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the BFG, James the Giant Peach, was a British spy in World War II. He was primarily assigned to operate in the United States to win over support to the early war effort, while the U.S. was still neutral. Story 135. The USA military had so many Purple Heart, Wounded Eliminate Soldier medals made in anticipation for the canceled invasion of Japan in 1945 that they had a stockpile that lasted into the 21st century. Story 136. Even 4,000, 5,000 years ago, people back then had the ancient time-sold days and wonder about them like we do today. Story 137. The pyramids were built around 4,000 years ago. You know what else was around 4,000 years ago? Mammoths. The woolly mammoth went extinct on the mainland 6,000 years ago, but a fairly large population survived on Wrangel and St. Paul Island. Story 138. In World War II, British newspapers didn't want to report on stories they got about the Holocaust because they already made up stories just like that as propaganda during World War I. Story 139. Sui-Goguryeo Wars. The Sui dynasty's invasion of Goguryeo with an army of over 1 million soldiers from 598 to 614. Sui dynasty's Emperor Yangdi launched the largest invasion in 612. He mobilized an enormous army, estimated to be over 1.1 million troops. Despite their overwhelming numbers, the Sui forces were decisively defeated by the Goguryeo army, led by General Ulji Mundeok at the Battle of Salsu. This immense loss crippled the Sui dynasty, contributing significantly to its downfall and eventual replacement by the Tang dynasty. Story 140. Oklahoma City is often referred to as the city that appeared overnight due to its remarkably rapid establishment during the land run of 1889. While it was not literally built in a single night, the speed at which it was settled and developed is an extraordinary historical event. Story 141. After WW2, the British suggested to bury a nuclear bomb in Germany as a nuclear landmine. It was intended to be buried on the North German plain and detonated either via remote wire or an 8-day timer in the event of a Soviet invasion. But Britain's engineers soon faced a chilling problem. The bomb's electronics, if buried during a German winter, could freeze and fail. After considering insulation layers like fiberglass blankets, a more outlandish solution emerged. Engineers proposed placing live chickens inside the bomb casing, along with food and water for about a week. The chicken's body heat, around 1,000 BTU per bird per day, was expected to keep the mechanisms from freezing. Fortunately, the project was shelved by February 1958, largely due to the unacceptable risks of radioactive fallout and the political backlash of contaminating Allied territory. Advances in nuclear weaponry and more practical alternatives, like built-in heaters or missiles, also rendered the concept obsolete. The project was called Operation Blue Peacock. Story 142. Some natives' names weren't translated literally, but rather changed so they wouldn't offend Americans here. Comanche chief Patsnaquahip is known as Buffalo Hump, but in reality the meaning of his name is closer to arousal that won't go down. Olive Oatman, which was kidnapped by the Yavapayas but was later assimilated in the Mojave, was called Sponsa, a name associated with woman's genitals. The list goes on, and you may find other examples in books detailing Native participants at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Story 143. Charles Lee was challenged to a second duel, scheduled to take place after the Lee-Lawrence duel portrayed in the musical Hamilton. From Baron Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand Freiherr von Steuben. Yes, that was his full name. Baron von Steuben withdrew his challenge on the grounds that it would be unbecoming for him to duel an opponent with an existing, if superficial, wound. Story 144. Universal Studios lost a legal case against Nintendo about Donkey Kong being too close to King Kong, because Universal had previously won a case by arguing that King Kong was public domain. Story 145. Cleopatra lived closer in history to the opening of the first Pizza Hut than she did the completion of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Story 146. It's often said that the USA is the only country to have dropped a nuclear weapon outside of tests, and that was on Japan. That's only half true. The USA dropped 2 on Japan, but even more on her own territory. Story 147. Dinosaurs weren't known to be dinosaurs when Washington was president and alive. The discoveries happened after him. Story 148. The hobbits went to Mount Doom and destroyed the ring. The pyramids were erected as a homage to the feat. Story 149. There was once a battle about to commence. As the armies formed up, a meteor exploded in the sky between the armies, knocking everyone to the ground. Both sides took it as a sign and sued for peace immediately. Story 150. Did you know Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramid? History blows my mind. Story 151. The Germans were building wooden air bases to use as decoy bases for the British to bomb. The RAF knew this was happening, waited for the Germans to finish building a base, then dropped a wooden bomb on it. Story 152. This was literally the next post up on my feed. A running back has won the Heisman Trophy every single year that ends in 5. Story 153. The entire life of Timothy Dexter, famous author of his autobiography, A Pickle for the Knowing Man, which includes no punctuation. Best explained, unsurprisingly, by Salmonella. Story 154. One of the high-ranking Nazis tried, condemned, and hanged at Nuremberg was a man named Alfred Rosenberg. Story 155. The last living samurai and Abraham Lincoln could have sent a fax to one another if they had wanted to. Story 156. Prior to the American Civil War, the U.S. nearly started a war with Britain over the shooting of a pig. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. Story 157. In the 1850s-60s, the southern half of China was conquered by a guy who thought he was Jesus Christ's little brother and forcibly converted his subjects to his version of Christianity. 20 to 30 million people died. Story 158. The last great victory against the British during the War of 1812 occurred weeks after the war was over. Story 159. TLDR. The United States government's ability to execute people for the crime of espionage is entirely dependent on women's hats. It sounds like something a madman would say, but it's true. No, really. I even have footnotes and everything. And make sure you check out part 2 for the thrilling conclusion. But back to the eliminate people over women's hats. How did we even get to this point? Well, first with a question. When did World War II end? The reason we have to ask this question is because the law that granted the U.S. government its current power to execute people for espionage was the Espionage Act of 1917. This act was codified into a series of laws in U.S. Code, Chapter 38, Chapter 37, and in particular Section 794. Gathering or delivering defense information to aid foreign government. This is the only section that has a passing penalty attached rather than just jail time. It also expressly includes the term in time of war in subsection B, where the shall be punished by passing part is. In June 1917, when the Espionage Act was passed, in time of war had a very specific legal meaning. It meant that there had to have been a formal declaration of war by Congress. And wouldn't you know it, just 2 months earlier, Congress had declared war. But that war ended, and it wasn't until December 8, 1941, that Congress declared war again, against Japan this time. Unrelated, but the last time the United States declared war was on June 4, 1942, against Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. So once again the question, when did World War II end? Well, from a legal standpoint, in the United States at least, it ended on April 28, 1952. Probably not the date you were expecting, right? 1952? World War II was still going in 1952? Yes, technically. We weren't still bombing people and I guess we were in Korea, but that was something else. From the U.S. government's perspective, World War II was still going on in 1952. Because from the government's perspective, World War II was really just a set of continuing states of emergency authorized by a declaration of war that allowed for special powers by the U.S. government, including Title 18, Section 794. As long as the states of emergency were still legally ongoing, the war was still ongoing. Those states of emergency weren't formally ended until April 28, 1952, when the Treaty of San Francisco finally came into effect and the state of war between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan came to an end. Meanwhile, because of the lack of any formal declaration of war for Korea, this meant that there was, as far as Title 18, Section 794 was concerned,